As of 2020, about 1 in 5 Americans took psychiatric medications for their mental health. Only about 50% of antidepressant users are satisfied with their treatment, and some researchers argue that the long-term benefit of psychiatric medications are small compared to the potential health costs and side effects. Pharmaceutical companies are in the crosshairs of HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., along with so-called revolving door conflicts of interest, where FDA officials will start working for pharmaceutical companies or vice versa. To sort through all of this, I've invited Ms. Sharyl Attkisson to share her research and investigation of pharmaceutical companies, how they mislead, manipulate, and sometimes hurt everyday consumers to make more and more money. So Ms. Attkisson has won Emmy Awards for her investigative journalism. She hosts the Sunday TV program Full Measure, and she has authored the New York Times bestseller Follow the Science, where she details the findings that she's sharing with us today about pharmaceutical companies and some of their practices. So Ms. Attkisson, it is such a privilege to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me today to discuss this difficult topic.
Thank you for having me.
So let's dive right into it. You've done a lot of investigating into pharmaceutical companies and now psychiatric medication, of which these companies make, particularly for children, are in the crosshairs because of Robert F. Kennedy's comments as Secretary of HHS. What are the main concerns that you found when it comes to these drug companies and how they do business in the U.S. particularly?
Well, this is a huge subject, and I'll just hit on a couple of points that maybe people aren't all too familiar with. Already, I think people listening to you may know that the drug companies have bought a great deal of influence with members of Congress through political donations. So Congress typically does the bidding in many cases, the pharmaceutical industry. And they may also know that the pharmaceutical industry, through advertising, buys a lot of influence with the media. But I think it's not as well reported, and what I do in my new book, Follow the Science, is talk about how the pharmaceutical industry is also entrenched and its influence in medical schools, in continuing medical education classes that doctors learn from after they get their licenses, in medical associations and nonprofits, and pretty much everything involved in the chain, including scientific journals. And people might be surprised to know that 2 heads and former heads of prestigious medical journals have been speaking out about how the pharmaceutical industry has co-opted this so-called science in their own journals. And these are articles that our doctors rely on because they're largely uninformed about the conflicts of interest at play. So pretty much every step of the way, the pharmaceutical industry has influence. And I don't blame them. They have a business model. The pharmaceutical industry is trying to, make money for its shareholders and for itself. That's what they're supposed to do.
Of course.
But Congress and the media have completely dropped the ball on the watchdog duties that should be helping to balance out the equation.
So you're saying that a lot of the financial incentives that the pharmaceutical companies have, I mean, that's kind of business as usual for any corporation, but in terms of government oversight and these medical journals, they've compromised because of the money that's involved.
Yeah, and the media as well, because at least we used to, when I was at CBS News for years, we reported independently on these issues. So did the New York Times, Washington Post, and the other networks for a time. And all that halted as the pharmaceutical industry started to buy more and more ads on our networks and television and sponsor things. And now I don't even think they have to call and exert influence because the media self-censors. They understand where their money's coming from, and they know what stories will and won't make it, on the air or make headlines.
Yeah, and I know, like you said in your book and some of your time at CBS, there were some stories that you wanted to pursue but got axed because of, I guess, what you assume was influence from some of these pharmaceutical companies because it wouldn't show them in a good light. What are some of those stories that you've experienced with stories that haven't been run because of that?
I mean, in the early 2000s, I was assigned to cover these things as an investigative reporter. So for years, CBS News embraced these. I broke a lot of news. I was recognized for my reporting with awards for this. And it kind of came to a slow halt where as the pharmaceutical industry gained more influence with government and partnership, we were still airing stories, but we were getting pushback at levels that I'm just not all familiar with how that works. But I could tell, or I could feel it, or I would be told, little things about why a story was being held, or maybe it wasn't going to air. Most of them continued to air until maybe 2004, 2005 time period. And then things changed. If you look at the media landscape, it changed for everybody about the same time. No longer was it easy to get those stories on the air. to give some of the CBS insiders credit, I had some great bosses, and they succeeded in continuing to get those stories on for quite some time before stopping. These were stories about the dangers of statin drugs, cholesterol-lowering drugs that so many people take. These are stories about all kinds of medicine. These are stories about the links between vaccines and autism, which is quite well documented now, even though what people hear constantly is that that's been debunked or that there's no evidence. Those things were being well covered, and then they went to a status where it got to be that was just a non-starter to do stories on those things.
Yeah. And from what you've studied, I know you said that you don't blame the doctors for just being part of the system, that this is where they're getting their information. But how do doctors normally choose what medications to prescribe?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, they're taught certain things in medical school about processes and procedures in innocuous sounding ways that end up benefiting this establishment. And, whether it's not teaching them to report, they don't say don't report vaccine injuries. They simply don't teach them to report them in the right way. And so there are things that happen once they get into practice that benefits the industry that they're not even aware of. And doctors like to think, and there's some in my family who are terrific doctors, smart people, but they like to think they're savvy as well, and often they are not. They're not savvy to the ways of this type of thing. So by and large, and not every doctor does it this way, I remember asking a doctor, gosh, there's so many medicines, there's thousands of them, how do you know? And he said, we all prescribe our 3 or 4 favorite ones. Now, there may be a greater range than that. This was a specialist. But the truth is they have their go-tos. They're not as up-to-date on all the... I'm probably up-to-date on more of the literature in some cases than some of the doctors that prescribe the drugs. They don't have time to go do the original research, not just what they're fed in the medical journals, but real research.
Sure.
And then they have sales reps, as you may know, from the pharmaceutical industry that visit their offices. The sales reps give a glowing picture of their medicine and what it's supposed to do.
Of course.
That is frequently how they choose drugs. And unfortunately, the sales reps have frequently gotten caught giving false information, lying to the doctors about what the drug is approved for, what it can be used for, what the risks are. This is very common. These are salespeople.
Yeah.
And yet, part of why the system is broken, there's so many weak links in this whole chain of medical, treatment. But when someone's caught doing something bad, like a salesperson giving false information, there's very little done. There may be on a macro level a fine issue that doesn't make any difference to the pharmaceutical company. But nothing has happened where, you hardly ever find with the giant fraud and multi-billions of dollars in fines paid out by the pharmaceutical industry, all the companies over the years, very rarely is anybody prosecuted for anything. So they just use that as a cost of doing business. They pay their fines if they're caught, and then they continue on.
So there's no real incentive to change, and then the doctors end up in this system where they are either underinformed or there's just recency bias based on which sales rep was in there most recently. And
then because medical side effects are not well tracked for many reasons we can discuss if you like, the doctors don't bother to well track them. I mean, in my opinion, there's no reason with today's technology that every time you get a medicine, there shouldn't be a simple way that you are offered to voluntarily fill out and should be asked to. Anything that changes in your body after you start taking the medicine, that's a potential side effect. Whether the doctor thinks so or not, whether it's on the label or not, that's the whole point, to identify new things nobody saw. And then the next time you go to the doctor for anything, a cold or you end up at the hospital, the first thing they should always ask and record is what medicines you're taking and if anything's changed in your body. And medical side effects and vaccine side effects have been documented up to years later. So this should all be going into a database. It doesn't mean everything you record is caused by the medicine, but you won't capture the new adverse events unless you capture all of them and go through them in a really thorough and meaningful way. And it's really not being done right now.
Right. And so I appreciate that you brought up the issue of side effects, and especially as a therapist, talking to people who are taking psychiatric medications, sometimes the cost of taking those medications in side effects leads to them having to take more medications to medicate away the side effects. And so one of the things that you mentioned is that your main concern is that there's underreporting of these potential side effects, or even excluding ones that are not listed on the label. So how do companies hide or underplay the potential side effects of their medications?
Well, there's many ways. I will go to the first point of if something isn't on the label, For example, Viagra didn't used to have blindness on the label until I reported that Viagra was linked to blindness. I saw it before it was actually put on the label because it's
Wow.
not hard to see when you look at the adverse event reports, even as imperfect as they are. But they get those reports first. They know, I believe the drug companies know a lot of what's going on. So job one for them, and this has been proven in some cases, is to stall. So once they know a drug may be problemsome, the whole point is let's delay how long before the drug gets a warning or is pulled from the market, because in the meantime, we can make enough money to pay all the lawsuits. You know, that's the cost of doing business that's calculated up front. So they may say at some point when they get in real trouble, all right, we're going to agree to hold an FDA meeting, or the FDA and they consult in 4 months. You know, not now, it's never now, it's in 4 months. And that 4 months helps them buy the time to sell enough medicine so that if it's withdrawn or warned and there are lawsuits, that they can pay those. So there are delays. There are many ways in studies that they hide adverse events by toying with the data in a way that used to not be allowed or accepted, not scientific. But I think one of the biggest ways is not publishing the studies that show the side effects. So since they sponsor and pay for most of the studies, they've now tightened up their contracts, so it's not like the old days before your time. It was anybody that studied anything would publish the results, good or bad for the drug.
Yeah.
Got to be a time when the drug companies didn't like that, so they started tightening up the research contracts. So you think a study's done at the University of so-and-so, you assume it's independent because you don't understand that's being paid for by the drug company. And then it comes out wrong or bad or doesn't show a benefit or shows a huge risk. You'll never see that. I mean, I'm not saying 100% of the time. I would say frequently.
Sure.
So there may be, for the sake of example, 8 bad studies showing a drug causes horrible side effects and doesn't work. And one study that shows maybe a mild benefit for a short period of time, and then they cut off the data points when the benefit went away, and they only take that one little section and they publish that. All you see and all your doctor sees is one study that looks promising.
Right.
You don't know that there were 8 studies that really would have warded you away from that medicine. So that's another way that they, skew things.
Yeah, so there's just they're hiding the research or burying the research that might show that there's a potential problem. And one thing that really stuck out to me when you were talking about your first point is that the companies decide, maybe it's more complicated than that, but they decide when they want to meet with the FDA. And that's a scary characterization of the power that they have.
It's such a symbiotic relationship. I'm not behind the closed doors when it happens, but we have all come to know when we've covered the FDA that it's a partnership where the FDA, instead of seeing us as customers or clients or whatever you want to say, they literally call the pharmaceutical industry their customers and their stakeholders.
Wow.
That's who they think that they're supposed to please and cater to and work with. So frequently, more often than not, these things are done in partnership and in consultation and through negotiations with FDA. It's not the FDA coming in as an agency and saying, you must do this at this time.
Wow.
It's very, very rare that something like that happens.
Yeah, so the power dynamic is actually very different. We're taught to think that the FDA is on our side. They're the watchdog. They're keeping the public safe. But in terms of the language that they use, that's not even really the case, that their priorities are a lot different.
Well, there's some fantastic FDA scientists, but as I've learned, their jobs in rooting out safety ahead of time, looking through the studies before a drug is affirmed and approved, they've been minimized. They got to the point, I don't know if it's still the case today, but there was a time when they used to speak, the scientists on a drug's pre-approval would be invited to speak at the public meeting to talk about any concerns they saw. There came a time when they were no longer allowed to speak.
Wow.
The FDA wouldn't let their own scientists talk about risks. There were all kinds of things. So there are good people there doing the good work.
Yeah.
But this was a management thing that's been going on for decades at the FDA, just getting more and more of a grip over the independence of the agency and becoming more, I believe, an arm of the pharmaceutical industry.
So let me talk a little bit more about the potential conflicts of interest. Like you mentioned, in terms of the funding from these drug companies to fund research about their drugs that they're producing. But that's one of the most alarming things that you mentioned in your book, that sometimes these researchers will also not disclose potential conflicts of interest, as well as what I mentioned earlier, the revolving door phenomenon, where officials from the FDA will start working for one of these pharmaceutical companies or vice versa. I think there was one particularly highlighted person in the news recently who did just that. So how can we even, as consumers, begin to make informed decisions about healthcare if all these studies are not given full context of what might be influencing findings?
Well, remind me of that question in a minute because I want to point out one more
Yeah,
thing.
for sure.
There are sometimes independent studies. Sometimes the government does fund a study that you wouldn't think they would fund. Researchers typically say it's impossible to get funding if you're not going to answer a question the government pharmaceutical industry wants you to answer. But that's not always true. So sometimes studies that find something important do get published.
Okay,
But what happens after that, let's say one study raises issues about a medicine,
sure.
the pharmaceutical industry has limitless money to commission 10 studies that will say none of that's true.
Yeah.
And they can do that, whether it's true or not. They can make studies come and look as though they can pick apart the one study, try to get it retracted, debunk it 1,000 different ways. I almost feel like my thinking, I go with this counterintuitive thing. When you see 10 studies saying something and telling you the one study was wrong, it makes me want to look at that one study more carefully and give due consideration to the notion that that may be right and that powerful interests are working very hard to make us not think the study's right. So it's a very difficult, cognitive exercise to go through these days when you ask, how are we to trust what we see?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to just say, read the book, but in the last chapter, I've tried to give some sources for people that have, I advise, look to people who have proven accurate in the past about key issues. It's not that hard. You have to do a little legwork, but why would you keep counting on the same public authorities, for example, or experts who were wrong about everything with COVID? Why would they still be quoted now, and why would you believe them? We now have a track record, and we can look at certain scientists and researchers and doctors who proved correct on things. I turn to them more often next time. It's just sort of the logical thing that you would do.
Sure.
And there's some list of names, and not just doctors, but also information sources that have proven to be, accurate, and they were sort of on the leading edge, not bringing up the tail on everything. And when we're coming to talking about health issues and so on, so I tend to go to those same people again. And when I see huge, what I call narratives, everybody in the press reporting the same thing, and the scientific journals saying that, and they're telling you not to believe something, I really think that today serves as a signal to make you take a more careful look at the thing that they don't want you to believe. Because so often that turns out to be the case.
Like it's too targeted, they protest too much.
Right.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And so talk a little bit about this revolving door phenomenon. I guess if you break it down a bit, why does it matter that FDA officials will make the move over to pharmaceutical companies and then vice versa?
Well, if you think of how important the job of regulating this multi-billion or trillion-dollar industry is, and that the decisions you make could either hurt your chances because you're not going to work at the FDA forever. They make good salaries, but it's not like working in the pharmaceutical industry.
Sure.
The decisions you make could either feather your nest for a future job where you're set for life, or it could make it where you're never going to work for a drug company. And I would say most of them tend to be pharmaceutical friendly. So if they're thinking about that next job, of course, the decisions they make and the interactions they have with the industry are going to be friendlier than maybe they ought to be. We saw Dr. Julie Gerberding, who headed up the CDC, make so many questionable decisions about vaccines, for example, when she was there, giving false information about vaccines, and then going to work as head of vaccines for GlaxoSmithKline as soon as she left the CDC. We have seen a case, and I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he came, this is almost reverse. I believe, my opinion based on the evidence is, he went on assignment to the FDA to change some rules. So he worked for a pharmaceutical company, got hired by the FDA in the legal department, changed some important rules that the company or companies wanted, and then went back to the private company. I think that's just simply the companies loaning their people to the FDA to get something changed and then going back. So that's how I think, in my opinion, corrupt things can be.
And I know you've talked about in your book researchers who had difficulty publishing their research or their studies because of pressure from these pharmaceutical companies. And I have to imagine that these companies wouldn't have been too happy about you publishing your book. So if any, what obstacles did you encounter along the way of publishing this book that's exposing a lot of these industry practices?
I really didn't have any, and I was, I guess, a little surprised. I thought there could be something. But I made sure this was the idea of my publisher, HarperCollins. I've published with in the past. So they wanted this. It wasn't as though I convinced them and they were under pressure to do something they didn't want. They thought of this idea. And then, as with all I do, I take such great care to make sure my facts are as buttoned down and documented, as humanly possible. I make sure to go through a lot of legal reviews and fact checks so that if I don't want them to have little things to complain about, because then they try to disparage the entire work. That's another tactic. You make a little meaningless mistake and then they'll say the whole book's been debunked. So I was pretty careful, very careful about that. Haven't had any pushback, but there have been some changes. So a couple things I exposed in the book. The industry, I can tell you, has made a couple of specific changes, and there's maybe more. But I reported on false information in the Merck manual that doctors learned from in med school. It was false information. Merck was teaching doctors about their own HPV vaccine. Shockingly, when I looked up that section, just because I had a suspicion, Merck is teaching doctors to be that the HPV vaccine Gardasil has no serious adverse events reported with it, which I knew was wrong because everything from paralysis to death has been reported from this vaccine. It's very controversial. So I went and looked at the label. It's got dozens and dozens of serious adverse events on the label.
Yeah.
And I mentioned in the book that how can doctors be taught, how does the med schools allow it, how do the medical associations allow doctors to be taught false information? Well, after my book was published and I talked about this a little bit, they took that line out.
Wow.
And did they replace it with the adverse events? No. They just cut out that whole section that said there are no serious adverse events, and now it's just blank last time I looked. But anyway, there's been a couple of changes. I could go through, if I had time, the whole Merck manual, which again is a medical school reference, and I'm sure I could find thousands of things to take issue with. Shouldn't somebody be doing that besides me?
Right.
That's what's shocking. I would expect the medical schools to be more independent and medical associations to be better watchdogs. But since they've been co-opted too, they're now just weak links in the chain. But I think that should be up to them to make sure that the medical references they use are factually accurate, especially when they're written by a drug company.
Right. And that's the difficult piece, because I think, like you're talking about, these drug companies have found ways to ingratiate themselves or put themselves in positions to, like you talk about with the continuing education for doctors, or even just the initial education for doctors, to be funding that, providing resources that they author. And that makes it really difficult for us as consumers who don't have maybe the time or the resources to be able to look into all of that, to really know how we advocate for ourselves. So for the average person, I guess, how would you encourage them to be able to advocate for themselves against this monolith of a pharmaceutical industry?
Well, I'm sorry to say that it requires more research than you should have to do, because I think there was a time when I certainly relied on all the medical professionals and public health officials. CDC is the experts, and I didn't question it, and it's just not that simple anymore. So there are new resources being started up, which I think is one of the good things that came out of COVID. Great published mainstream doctors who didn't agree with not being able to treat their patients with things that would have helped them, for example, have broken away, and they're starting new medical associations, new nonprofits that are conducting independent research. Ask why some of the most chronic health problems that we all understand, we've seen over the past 20 years arise, that no one seems to care in the government. No one's issued an emergency over the autism epidemic. Why is that not an emergency? How about a health emergency over the fact that American men, and I believe this is a trend around the globe, their testosterone levels are 20 to 30% lower, let's say at age 40, than their fathers at age 40. And sure, they're happy to treat it, but why isn't someone saying, what in our exposures is causing this? And let's prevent it. Let's not just treat it. Let's figure out and stop the cause. That's all because the system is broken. It's just geared toward treating and making money off of these things. So I just think you have to look to some of these new resources that have developed. FLCCC was the frontline critical care doctors during COVID that broke away from the establishment. They've just changed the name of their organization. I think if you type in FLCCC on the computer, the new organization's name will come up. But again, there's many groups now that are putting out information and resources and conducting studies, and even have patient resources where you can find like-minded doctors who are looking at the functional medicine aspects of what you can do for your health and your family's health. And I thought some good advice I had recently was, so many people go to their regular doctors, and I've had some fantastic doctors, so I don't want to disparage all of them. But too often the way the system's set up, they don't know what's wrong with you, or they can't tell you what's wrong with you, or they send you to specialists, or they send you through this diagnostic pipeline that never ends. Doesn't really seem to help. Put you on a lot of medicines. There are practices that don't do that, and they're called functional medicine practice, root cause medicine practice, integrative medicine practice. And I would say try to find a good practice with one of those words on it if you're having a health concern that's not being addressed by establishment medicine.
Yeah.
On the downside, a lot of that's not covered by insurance, because guess who lobbies to make sure insurance only covers the stuff that benefits the companies donating to Congress. But I mean, that's just one of the best suggestions I can come up with. And I know so many people who don't have a lot of money, but who are spending some of what they have going to these kinds of doctors to get answers to vexing health problems, and many of them meeting with a lot of success.
For sure. And I think you talk about in your book that there were a lot of people who dealt with chronic conditions, I think particularly long COVID, that were able to see some of these functional medicine doctors and were able to actually find solutions instead of just medicating. And so I think in terms of the long term of what you're talking about, maybe there's more of an upfront cost, but compared to being on medications for the rest of your life or having to...
That's a good point, yeah.
It's a really hard calculation to make, though. So let me ask you this then. I know you've pointed out a lot of the issues within the pharmaceutical industry and how that's hurting the average consumer. If you could make one change to how this industry works in the U.S., what would that be?
I probably would. I don't know the mechanics of this. I'm just a journalist.
Yeah.
I think it has not been a good thing to have prescription drug advertising on television and in media, which is a relatively new development in this country. And we're one of the only countries that allows it. And I don't think anything good has come of it, because I've seen it compromise primarily the media in a way that independent reporting can't be done. I think if you saw that relationship end, as long as they couldn't figure out another way to influence media by sponsoring other things, you would see the media turn back and start covering these things more independently and start doing investigations like we were doing in the early 2000s. So I would say it's not good to have the prescription drug advertising.
And I know you highlighted in your book and just now that we're one of the only countries that allows pharmaceutical advertising. So I don't know if you've done research into this, but what's the difference in the effects for countries that don't have that advertising versus us that do?
Well, it's hard to say how much is due to that relationship, but in other countries, as in Europe, and certainly they're not a perfect model for medical health, but they tend to pull drugs that we pull off the market, for example. They've done it earlier. They've done it faster. They sometimes are quicker to warn about drug safety issues and food safety issues as well. And I'm not sure what that has to do with the advertising relationship, but I feel like there's something there. And then drugs, of course, cost much less in other countries, and that's not entirely because of advertising here, but maybe there's a relationship to that as well.
Yeah, and I can see that, like, that's part of the chain that you're talking about. But if we were to reduce or eliminate that pharmaceutical advertising, then, like you said, that frees up investigative reporters like you to be able to pursue that information, to seek the truth of what's actually going on with these medications and these drugs. And like you're talking about, maybe the word gets out sooner that there are adverse effects or that there are concerns associated with a certain medication. People can at least know that, even if it's not being pulled.
No single change, you have to then point to something else that would have to happen. But it would not be hard to make the databases we report our vaccine and drug adverse events, to make them far more robust and helpful, and to have them analyzed in a more independent and quick way. That's just simple if someone wanted to do it. And I think that could and should be done.
Ms. Sharyl, that's all the questions that I have for you. I want to ask if there was anything else that you felt like you should be leaving people with, or you'd like a final word that you'd like to share with everyone who's watching.
Well, I do like to say that as disastrous as COVID was, with all the disinformation and misinformation that came from the people claiming others were doing it, this is twisted relationship, one of the good things that came out of it is people started paying attention. We've been suffering with chronic health disorders for decades without establishment medicine paying much or the right kind of attention to it. And all of a sudden, people who never really thought about it, like I was pre-2000, started questioning the medical establishment and asking about the conflicts of interest and saying to themselves, if they weren't honest about this, what else haven't they been honest about? And then in turn, it started to make people who never considered themselves to be activists, it started turning them into sort of activists, because you take a mom or a dad that understands things are happening to their children.
Yeah.
And they don't know why health-wise, and then they start to make a relationship between the chemicals and pesticides in our food and our medicine. Suddenly the wheels start turning, and people will do anything for their kids. So there's just a whole group of people now. I think that's why we're where we are today in terms of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. heading HHS, Trump getting support from these kinds of moms who, many of them were not Republicans. They were sort of, a lot of them, quite frankly, liberal Democrats in the RF Kennedy Jr. sort of camp. But now they've come together over something that's very common among them. It's more important than many other issues. So I think that's been a good development that will help us force more answers and better responsibility among those who have responsibility for our health.
All right. Ms. Sharyl, thank you so much for joining me to discuss a highly controversial and difficult topic. The work that you've done is invaluable, along with working to publicize your findings, like you said, so that people can make more informed decisions, or at least know where some of the blind spots are in our healthcare system. So everyone watching, please do check out Ms. Attkisson's book, Follow the Science, to better understand some of the ways that these pharmaceutical companies operate in a lot more detail, a lot more sources than we were able to really pull today, and just how to make choices regarding your healthcare. So thank you all so much for watching. Thank you, Ms. Attkisson, for joining us today.